Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling a word that's, well, it's everywhere: democracy. You hear it constantly, right? Political speeches, news headlines, casual chats. But how often do we actually stop and, really unpack what it means? So, okay, let's try and do that. What is democracy fundamentally?
Well, the word itself, it comes from ancient Greek.
Yeah.
Demos, that means the people,
Right.
and concracy, which is like rule or government.
Mm-hmm.
So put it together, rule of the people. Pretty simple on the surface. And Abraham Lincoln, he gave us that really famous, concise version, government of the people, by the people, for the people.
Exactly. And, for this deep dive, that's our mission, really, to explore how this huge, often kind of slippery concept has changed over time. We want to look at the different shapes it takes, the big debates about what it really is, and maybe most importantly, what it actually asks of you as a citizen. Because as we'll definitely see, it's not just a political system you read about. It's a way of being. Okay, so let's go way back. Ancient Greece, Athens specifically. That's where we usually point to as the birthplace. What did it actually look like there on the ground?
Well, in Athens, it meant pretty direct involvement, actually, for all free men anyway. And that's a really important distinction because obviously slaves, women, they were left out.
Right, yeah.
But for those free men, there was this idea of equal participation in public matters. Big decisions came out of free, open discussion, and they had this deep respect for their customary laws. The Athenians, they were really proud of distinguishing their system, their laws, from what they saw as just arbitrary rule elsewhere.
That does sound incredibly forward-thinking for the time, but I mean, it couldn't have been perfect, right? Even back then, were people pointing out flaws or problems?
Oh, absolutely. That's a crucial point. Even in Athens, it wasn't universally loved. You take someone like Plato. He was a really sharp critic. His main worry was basically that the average person just wasn't educated enough, wasn't wise enough to choose good leaders. He really feared that, smooth-talking, maybe selfish orators could just manipulate everyone and lead the state to ruin.
Ah, the classic wisdom of the crowd problem, or lack thereof, maybe. And Aristotle, Plato's student, he also had a sort of complex view, didn't he? Maybe not fully critical, but definitely nuanced.
He did, yeah. Aristotle saw democracy mostly as the rule of the many, and he often specifically meant the poorer citizens. And what's really fascinating, I think, is that Aristotle actually classified democracy among what he called the perverted forms of government.
Perverted. That sounds harsh. What did he mean by that?
Well, think of it like a corrupted or degraded version of an ideal. His reasoning was that democracy tended to focus too much on the sort of selfish interests of the average person, the mediocres, instead of the overall good of the whole community.
So it could become a tyranny of the majority, serving only their interests. But did he see any good in it?
Yes, definitely. He wasn't entirely dismissive. Aristotle did see value in the collective judgment of the people. He had this idea that, when people act together, they can sometimes be as good or even better at judging things than individual experts. You use that great analogy, right? The user or master of a house will be a better judge of it than the builder, and the guest will be a better judge of a feast than the cook.
I love that analogy. It makes so much sense. The person experiencing it knows best. But okay, even with that potential upside, what were his main complaints? The demerits as he saw them.
Well, they were pretty significant for him. He thought democracy rested on a kind of false equality. This idea that if people are equal in one way, like legally, they must be equal in every way, including their ability to govern.
Ah,
And that, he felt, meant that real ability, real expertise, could just get swamped by sheer numbers. And those numbers, as Plato also worried, could be easily manipulated by clever tricks or emotional appeals. Aristotle even floated the idea of, limiting voting rights to more intelligent citizens. He actually favored what he called a mixed constitution, a blend of aristocracy and democracy as the most stable option.
so right from the start, this tension exists, balancing everyone's voice with the need for competence and wisdom. Okay, let's fast forward quite a bit now. Moving past the ancient world to more modern thinkers who really looked at democracy primarily as a form of government, how it's structured, how it functions, people like John Austin, James Bryce.
And James Bryce is a really key figure there. He's often described as, one of democracy's biggest champions, but also one of its most insightful critics, a most sympathetic critic, someone called him. He really studied it deeply. And he defined democracy essentially as the rule of the people expressing their sovereign will through votes, which, at the end of the day, for Bryce, really boiled down to the rule of the majority.
Rule of the majority. So why did he think that was so important? What was the big justification for him beyond just being a way to organize things?
Bryce's argument was that democracy's real value wasn't just in doing the basic jobs of government, protection, justice administration. He saw this crucial additional benefit. Democracy stimulates people to educate themselves. It broadens their horizons, precisely because they get to participate.
That makes a lot of sense. The act of participating makes you think more.
Exactly.
So for you listening, participation isn't necessarily about literally ruling day to day. It's more about setting the direction, choosing the goals, and really importantly, keeping an eye on the people you put in charge.
Yeah.
But Bryce, even though he's a champion, he definitely saw the downsides too, didn't he? He had that list.
Oh, yeah. He laid out what he called 6 outstanding evils of democracy as he observed it. Things like the power of moneyed interests influencing politics.
So relevant.
Totally. Politics becoming just a way for people to get rich or gain personally. Government extravagance, a tendency to undervalue skilled or expert people in public service. The damaging effects of intense party politics. And of course, politicians just playing to the crowd to get votes.
Wow, that list could have been written yesterday. But here's a key question he asked, right? Which of those are actually unique to democracy?
That's exactly what Bryce dug into. He pointed out that the first 3, money and politics, personal gain, extravagance, those are probably you find in almost any kind of government, democratic or not. They're sort of universal temptations of power.
Right.
The last 3, undervaluing expertise, party divisions, pandering for votes, those, he felt, were more specifically linked to democratic systems. But crucially, he didn't think they were unsurmountable. They were challenges democracy had to manage, not fatal flaws. So his conclusion was pretty nuanced. Democracy hasn't really increased the amount of bad stuff in the world, it just channels it differently. And he pointed to its unique defenses. Law, of course, but also public opinion. That, he thought, was a special safeguard you don't get elsewhere. He was hopeful, ultimately, but felt it all depended on human wisdom.
Okay, now here's where, for me, it gets really interesting. This idea of liberal democracy, which is mostly what we think of today, it's actually, well, relatively new. And it might surprise you to hear that for a long time, liberal thinking was often quite anti-democratic. They pushed for things like, only letting property owners vote well into the 19th century.
Right. It seems like a contradiction, doesn't it? Liberalism, focused on individual rights, limited government. Democracy, focused on popular rule. Why did they end up merging?
Well, it really came down to big historical shifts. You had capitalism taking off, industrialization changing everything, and crucially, the rise of a large, organized working class demanding political power, demanding a voice. Liberal states basically had to adapt to survive. They had to incorporate democratic principles, like wider voting rights, to maintain stability and legitimacy.
And what emerged from that kind of historical compromise, was this thing we call liberal democracy. It tries to balance capitalism and mass demands, often through things like the welfare state, universal voting rights, combined with a generally free market economy.
Exactly. And that brings us to the core principles of this model. First up, government by consent. But it's not just any consent. It has to be rational consent, and that absolutely needs an environment of free and open discussion.
This discussion happens basically on 2 levels. Inside legislatures, where you need a functioning opposition to challenge the government, and out in the public sphere, where leaders communicate with citizens, often, through mass media. Second principle, public accountability. If a government gets its power from the people's consent, it has to answer back to the people. Thinkers like John Locke saw government as a kind of trustee needing constant watching. And you mentioned John Stuart Mill earlier. His work on liberty is huge here. That famous idea that you can only restrict someone's freedom to prevent harm to others. That underpins the whole system. Liberty of thought, expression, association. These are essential for citizens to actually hold the government accountable.
And we absolutely have to mention Jean-Jacques Rousseau here, the great theorist of popular sovereignty. His idea was really quite radical for the time, wasn't it? That sovereignty doesn't just start with the people, it stays with them.
Totally. He saw elected officials not as true representatives who could think for themselves, but more like agents or delegates, just carrying out the people's will. He imagined a very, very active citizenry directly involved in making laws.
Which leads naturally to the next principle, majority rule. How does that work in practice?
Well, in modern democracies, since direct involvement isn't always feasible, we rely on voting. Political equality is key. One person, one vote. No discrimination based on things like religion, race, sex, wealth, unless there's a very specific justifiable reason, like age limits or excluding criminals. The system banks on the idea that the majority view is likely the wisest course, But, and this is crucial with the understanding that the minority always has the right to try and persuade the majority through open debate.
Which brings us right to the next point, recognition of minority rights. This seems absolutely essential to prevent that tyranny of the majority we talked about earlier.
Absolutely vital. You need legal safeguards in place. In diverse societies, minorities might rightly fear being overlooked or even oppressed by the majority. So these rights protect everything from, basic cultural expression to preventing actual harm or discrimination. They are fundamental. And finally, underpinning all of this is constitutional government. This is the idea of government by laws, not by men. Democracy needs a framework, a set of established rules and procedures to translate popular will into action fairly and consistently. Sticking to those procedures is crucial for stability and preventing corruption. You can't just bend the rules when it's convenient.
Okay, so those are the big principles, but how do they actually translate into practice? What are the nuts and bolts, the mechanisms that make liberal democracy function day to day? First, seems obvious, but you need more than one political party, right?
Absolutely essential. Free competition between parties gives people a genuine choice. They can choose between different leaders, different programs, different visions for the future. That's why systems with only one party, even if they hold elections, aren't generally considered democratic in the liberal sense. There's no real alternative for voters.
And second, political offices aren't restricted to some elite group.
Exactly. Power should come from popular support, not from birthright or wealth or connections. Everyone should have, in theory, an equal right to run for office, and terms are limited. Interestingly, sometimes reserving seats for specific minority groups or weaker sections is actually seen as strengthening democracy by ensuring those voices get heard directly.
Makes sense. Third mechanism, periodic elections based on universal adult franchise. Everyone gets a vote.
Yep. This is really the only practical way to run a representative government in a large country today. Every adult citizen gets the vote without discrimination. And critically, voting has to be secret, so people can make their choice freely, without fear or pressure.
Fourth, the protection of civil liberties. We touched on this with accountability, but it's worth restating.
Absolutely crucial. Freedom of thought, speech, religion, the right to assemble peacefully, freedom from arbitrary arrest. These are non-negotiable. They allow citizens to organize, to influence the government, and they're vital for an independent media to function and keep the public informed.
And the fifth mechanism, often seen as a cornerstone, independence of the judiciary.
Yes, the separation of powers is key here. While other branches might interact, the courts need to be independent, impartial. Judges should be appointed based on merit, shielded from political pressure, so they can make fair decisions based on the law. This builds public trust in the whole system.
Okay, but here's the big but. Does just having all these structures, parties, elections, courts, rights on paper, does that automatically guarantee real democracy?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is, because in many places, especially, say, developing nations, you can have all the formal institutions, but still face what some call inner distortions.
Inner distortions, like political parties that really only represent the interests of powerful groups, big business, landowners, maybe a specific caste or ethnic group instead of the broader population.
Right.
Or a political culture where citizens are just seen as passive voters, not active participants. Where maybe political office is still effectively reserved for a tiny privileged class.
Or the media, even if technically free, might be controlled by those same interests, right? Shaping the news agenda.
Exactly. Or widespread illiteracy might make freedom of expression pretty meaningless for large parts of the population. Even an independent judiciary might, in practice, deliver justice that's skewed by social or economic power. So the practice, the day-to-day reality of democracy, is often very different from the formal structure. That gap is critical.
That distinction between structure and practice is so important. Okay, so given that direct democracy, everyone voting on everything just isn't practical in large modern states, we use representative democracy. How do we choose those representatives? What are the main ways societies have approached that?
Well, there are essentially two main models that have been discussed and sometimes tried. The one we're most familiar with is territorial representation, sometimes called geographic representation.
Right, like congressional districts or parliamentary constituencies.
Exactly. You divide the country into areas, constituencies, usually based on population size being roughly equal. And the voters in each area elect someone to represent that specific place. It's simple, it's convenient, people often feel a connection to their local representative.
But what are the downsides?
Well, critics point out that sometimes very local issues can dominate, overshadowing bigger national concerns. And it kind of assumes that everyone living in one geographic area has the same interests, which, is rarely true. Think of a diverse city district, for example.
Okay, so that's geographic. What's the main alternative idea?
The alternative is called functional representation. The idea here is that people should elect representatives based on their job, their function, or their major economic interest.
So like farmers elect farmer representatives, factory workers elect worker representatives, doctors elect doctor representatives, something like that.
Precisely. And those representatives would then focus on issues relevant to their specific function. Groups like the British Guild Socialists were big proponents of this early on.
That sounds logical in a way, ensuring expertise, but has it been widely adopted?
Well, here's the interesting bit. Functional representation was actually tried most notably under some totalitarian systems, like fascist corporatism in Italy. It was often used as a way to avoid real class conflict and competitive elections by creating these state-controlled functional groups.
Ah, okay, so maybe not the democratic ideal it sounds like on the surface.
Right, so perhaps unsurprisingly, most modern democracies have stuck primarily with territorial representation, although they often do have mechanisms for consulting specific functional groups like business associations or trade unions when making policy.
Got it. Now let's dig into the theories of representation. Once we've elected someone, what exactly is their job? What should their relationship be with the people who elected them? There are really different schools of thought here, aren't there?
Oh, vastly different. At one end, you have what you might call the reactionary theory. Thinkers like Thomas Hobbes. This is pretty elitist. It basically says authority lies with the government, the executive, maybe parliament. The people's role is just to sort of make their general feelings known, but the rulers decide.
Okay, pretty top-down. What's next?
Then there's the conservative theory. People like Edmund Burke are associated with this. It's a step more progressive. People get to choose their representatives who are still seen as generally wiser, part of an elite, and they can vote them out if they're unhappy. But once elected, the representative should use their own good sense and judgment, not just blindly follow instructions from back home.
Okay, trust the representative's wisdom. Then we get to the liberal theory, which is often described as closer to the true spirit of democracy.
Yes, the liberal theory. Think Locke, Jefferson. This view really emphasizes the wisdom of the ordinary person. Representatives are seen essentially as agents or messengers. Their job is to understand what their constituents want and translate that judgment into policy. They're much more closely bound to the voters' wishes.
And finally, the most, well, people-powered view.
That would be the radical theory. Rousseau is the key figure here again, and later groups like the New Left picked it up. This view holds the wisdom of the people in the highest regard, almost paramount. It's so focused on direct popular will that it sometimes even questions the value of representative government itself, preferring direct democracy whenever feasible. So you have this spectrum. But I think it's fair to say that the liberal theory, the representative as an agent reflecting constituents' views, is generally seen as the one that fits best with the practical realities of large-scale representative democracy today.
Okay, so we've decided who represents us and maybe what their role should be. Now, how do we actually count the votes? The electoral system itself. This can get complicated, but broadly speaking, what are the main types? Let's start with the one many listeners might be most familiar with. The plurality system, or first past the post.
Right. First past the post is pretty straightforward. You have single-member constituencies, and the candidate who gets the largest number of votes wins the seat. Importantly, they don't need to get more than 50%, just more votes than anyone else.
Like in the UK House of Commons, US House of Representatives, India's Lok Sabha.
Exactly. Widely used.
What are the main arguments for and against it?
Well, the big criticism is that it can feel unfair to smaller parties or minority viewpoints. Their votes might feel wasted if their candidate comes second or third, and it can lead to situations where a party wins a majority of seats with, say, only 40% of the total national vote. So it can distort the overall picture. But the defenders argue that it tends to produce strong, stable majority governments, usually dominated by two main parties. And they say it forces those major parties to be broad coalitions, appealing to diverse groups, including minorities, in order to win those individual constituency races.
Okay, so that's plurality. Next up, the majoritarian system. This sounds like it demands a higher threshold.
It does. In a majoritarian system, the winner must get an absolute majority. That means over 50% of the valid votes cast.
How do you achieve that if no one gets 50% on the first try?
There are a couple of main ways. One is the alternative vote, or ranked choice voting. Voters rank the candidates in order of preference. first, second, third.
Yeah.
If no one gets 50% of first preferences, the candidate with the fewest votes is eliminated, and their votes are redistributed according to the second preference